Hi, Andy.
Hi, Victoria.
Today we have Dr. David Kessler, who is an expert on grief and loss and how to heal from it.
Well, I look forward to the conversation. I think this is a topic that is perennially of interest.
Yes, let's get him on. Dr. David Kessler is one of the world's experts on grief, loss, and healing. He's the author of Finding Meaning, the Sixth Stage of Grief. In 2005, he co-authored the book on grief and grieving with Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross. David has a new online grief support program called Tender Hearts to help people navigate grief after the death of a loved one. And he also leads grief certification program for anyone who wants to turn their pain into purpose. Welcome, David.
I'm so excited to be with you both.
We're delighted to have you. And I thought we should begin with what made you decide to make grief your life's work?
You're right. You know, no one is in third grade and says, I want to be a death and grief expert. I had a mother who was in and out of hospitals growing up, and I thought that's the way it was.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was 13, she was hospitalized in a city hours away because she needed this new procedure that you couldn't really get called dialysis. And they gave her, the bioethicists voted she could get one dialysis treatment, which we know now wouldn't have been enough. And at that time, you also, unbeknownst to me, needed to be 14 to visit. When they asked me how old I was, I said 13. So it was a time when the family was an interference of the healing process. And you kept them out of the ICU. They could come in 5 minutes every 2 hours. We're at a hotel across the street. At one point, they yell fire. Everyone has to evacuate. The next thing we know, fire trucks pull up, and we think they're about to put the fire out on the 18th floor, but shooting begins.
Huh.
Wow.
So it turned out to be one of the first mass shootings in the US. It went on for 13 hours. So as this child, in a few days, I had the tragedy of the shooting and this trauma and seeing first responders and so many people who were in danger and killed. And I saw the police and some guests. And a couple of days later, my mother died. I'm not able to be with her. Even at 13, I came away feeling damaged, broken, unfixable, and I knew we could die better. And the only advice I got was be strong.
Huh.
Even at that young age, I'm like, we could do this all so much better. I never thought I would work on the better, but that's the beginnings of it.
That is a very powerful story. So I just want to let it sink in. And it makes me want to go in a different direction than I originally thought, which is, it sounds in a way like you were broken open by grief, that you were broken into your life's work by this childhood experience. And I have to say, in my life, I've also been broken apart by grief, and it has also changed the direction of my life in certain ways. And so I guess I want to ask you about that possibility, that post-traumatic growth, which is maybe the best that can ever come out of a bad situation. And yet, it's a tricky thing to talk about in the context of you still don't want to lose your mother. You still don't want to be in the presence of a tragedy.
Right. And I know we'll talk about that also when we get to Finding Meaning, the last book, but you're exactly right. You know now what I know now that I didn't know then, that, a broken heart is also an open heart. Mm-hmm. And that event, of course, I would not wish it on anyone. Those events ended up changing the trajectory of my life, shaping me differently. I went on to not just do death and dying, but became a reserve specialist police officer that I wanted to help out in horrific events because I'm like, oh my gosh, these people are putting their life in danger every day so I can walk around the world safely.
Mm-hmm.
When you were telling your story, one thing that I thought of is that during the pandemic, many people died alone and their families were not able to visit them or be with them in the hospital. And I have not read or heard much about the consequences of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you mentioned, and thank you for mentioning my online group. It's hundreds and hundreds of people online from all over the world. And I got to tell you, it felt like we saw early on tons of people who their grief was not getting witnessed. And then it felt like a lull. And now I'm seeing this huge uptick of people who were like, this is painful. I haven't talked about it. There was no funeral. We weren't there. And it feels like there's this new rise that's happening of people who are maybe coming out of the shock of what happened, and all their feelings are coming up now because it was so horrific. And I often talk about it. It's such a good point that when I was talking about here, my mother died alone. We weren't able to see her. We couldn't go in the hospital. There was a shooting. It was racially motivated. I'm like, that could be out of our headlines today.
Yeah.
So you have so much that you could bring to this conversation. One of the things that strikes me is often there's a lot of myths about grief and misconceptions about, how long it's supposed to last, what you do with it, what you say to someone who's grieving. Just want to give you a chance to speak about that a bit.
Oh, thank you so much. So I think you're exactly right. We are a grief illiterate society. We are a grief illiterate society. No one teaches about this. I often tell people, I feel like I'm teaching people what our great-grandparents knew. Mm-hmm. They knew how to be with the dying. They knew how to be in grief. In our modern society, we lost that. I often talk about, when I was a child, my father would be bringing me to school and we'd be behind a hearse that picked up a body at the hospital the night before. In our modern world, it's been sanitized. You're never behind a hearse anymore. The dead move around our cities in white unmarked vans. I tell people, if you've got a home built before the 40s, you've got a wide door because the casket used to come into your parlor. Eventually, the parlor moved into the funeral home, and it came out that we shouldn't refer to our front room as the parlor for the dying. It shouldn't be a dying room. It should be a living room. And the name got changed. And that whole experience got lost. And, illness moved into the hospital, death moved into the funeral home. We're so disconnected. How do we do it? So here's some basics around it. I would say grief is an organic experience. You don't need instructions on how to do it, but you got to not listen to all the messages of get over, be productive, be strong, don't give into it, all those things we hear in our modern society. I think that big question of how long does grief last? People always say to me, my wife's grieving, my sister's grieving, my dad's grieving. How long? And I say to them gently, how long's a person going to be dead?
Yeah.
If they're going to be dead for a long time, you're going to grieve for a long time.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you will always grieve with pain. To me, the goal of grief work is to eventually, in your own time, in your own way, grieve with more love than pain. It's interesting. You also mentioned the introduction, the program I do, the grief certificate program, which is a lot of therapists, physicians, coaches, nurses, and they all talk about they got no training on grief and loss. And I'll tell you, that's such an important area. I worked in the hospital for years with Press Ganey, and physicians would be so great at what they do. But then when it came to grief and loss, they had no sensitivity to it. So there's all these myths that if we live in this world, we know how to do it. And people are like, oh, there's tools, there's techniques. And one of the things is, look, most of us are schooled. And what are you going to do? What's the intervention? What's the assessment? And you get to grief, and my response is, oh, there's nothing to do. You're going to witness them. You're going to be with them. And we're like, but we're fixers. And I'm like, I understand. And grief, you're not broken. You don't actually need to be fixed. You need your grief witnessed. And, the interesting other thing is so much work has been done, like with Edward Tronick's work and, mirroring, in babies and how babies mirror their mother. Mm-hmm. And I always say to people, we're former babies. Like we're former babies. And, I tell the story of how one day I'm walking down the street and a guy says to me out of the blue as I walk by him, he goes, howdy. I went, howdy. I'm not a howdier. But he howdied me. My mirroring neurons kicked in and I howdied him back. And so it's the same with grief. We want to know our loved one's death mattered. Our grief matters. We want to be seen and have our pain seen in the eyes of another.
My personal experience of grief and what I observe in many people around me is that it is a process that people move through at varying rates. But there are a few people I know who get stuck. I have a woman friend now, she's in her 60s, who lost her husband, I think 15 years ago. She is totally stuck in grief. That is the only thing she thinks about. Her life has ended with his death. She's tried all sorts of things. I don't know what to suggest to her. There's no movement.
There's a few things there. It's interesting. We all have our own grief history, loss history. We're all raised differently about grief. We all buy into society's beliefs around griefs where you taught it's productive or they're with Jesus or they're in a better place or you should be happy or grieving is loyal. There's a million different beliefs. And for someone like that, you really need her to work with someone who sort of is going to uncover the core of what's underneath that. The other thing I often tell people is all grief does not have trauma, but all trauma has grief. My guess is there is probably some underlying trauma that's sort of also getting projected on that. Mm-hmm. And we see many people, just like you say, that what happens is grief is no longer a lifelong experience that they go through and change with, but it becomes something that becomes their identity and they become devoted to it and it becomes their life.
To expand on Andy's particular case, there are things that are helpful and things that are unhelpful. So one thing that I sometimes hear people say in a situation like that is your loved one wouldn't want you to not have a life. Is that helpful or unhelpful?
Unhelpful. It sounds good.
Yeah.
But it might just give some guilt. Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone hears and goes, oh my gosh, I never thought of that. Let me snap out. So ultimately, it isn't effective. Mm-hmm. And it's, of course, we want, the thing is, no one gets up in the morning and goes, let me get ready. I'm going to be really mean to someone in grief. No one says that. I mean, we're all doing this to help. But we haven't been taught, that my website is grief.com and I get to see the analytics of it. Mm-hmm. And the most visited page is the best and worst things to say to people in grief. And it's most visited at 3 a.m.
Oh, wow.
We don't know what to say. We don't know how to help. So that's part of that challenge. The other thing that is a little bit of my bias is I love group work. Mm-hmm. Like if I was working with this person, many times they're sort of yes, butting me and you don't understand and da-da, and it's that one-on-one work. When you're in a group, all of a sudden that person would hear a similar story and hear how someone else is kind of like them and suddenly find themselves in another story. And not only do we find ourselves in each other's stories, we find our healing in each other's stories. And so that's why I love bringing people together. And the pandemic changed everything. We used to be trying to get 6 people in the church basement or the hospital basement for a grief group. And if you wanted a sibling group or a death by suicide or a fentanyl poisoning, or just if your young child died or you're a fiance or your young spouse or you're an older spouse, there was no way to get a special group. Now in our World Wide Web, oh my gosh, it's online from your home. And there's a group exactly for your grief that we couldn't have done it in the physical world. So the opportunities are so open and different, and so many more of them.
I think many people are familiar with Elizabeth Kübler-Ross's stages of grief. Do I understand that you've added another one to that?
I do. Let me tell you what happened with that. So first of all, I want to go through some of the myths. Kubler-Ross wrote this incredible breakthrough book in 1969 on death and dying. Like, she was the Betty Ford of addiction. Like, no one had ever had these topics. She went to Congress. She lobbied for hospice, end-of-life care, groundbreaking work. And she mentioned these stages that she had actually adapted from Anna Freud. And there were these more than 5, but there was denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, depression. As you can imagine, the media sort of over the years turned it into 5 easy steps for death and grief. And it was very challenging for her personally, because here's a woman who wrote, 26 books, thousands of lectures, and people want to reduce your work to 5 words. And it was hard. And I would often say to her, one of the biggest criticisms you would hear is they don't work for grief, but we're using them for grief. And so I said, over the years, we had written one book together, Life Lessons. And I said, people need more from you on the stages. And she eventually one day called me and said, all right, I got it. We need to write something to adapt these stages for grief. So we wrote this book on grief and grieving, as you mentioned. And literally on page 1, Andrew, on page 1, we said, the stages are not linear. There's no one right way to do grief. There's no map for grief. Grief is organic. You do it your way. Literally, so many times when I hear the criticisms over the years of the stages, I'll go, did you look at page 1? Did you just read page 1? It's there. We agree with you. We agree. You got us. We agree. Kubler-Ross knew that. She would go nuts around the stages. So one of the things, denial, people know, is, I can't believe this happened. Anger, we have an anger reaction, which can be normal. Bargaining before death is the deal making. Please, God, let me have 5 more years. I'll be a better husband, wife. Then there's depression, which is sadness, and acceptance. There was always this challenge with acceptance that people thought there's one big acceptance and then the grief is over. That's another myth. I think there's layers of acceptance. So after all these years of doing this work, a number of years ago, my younger son, David, unexpectedly died. As you can imagine, it was brutal. I had to take my own advice. I had to go to a grief counselor. I had to go to an in-person grief group where I took my contacts out and put a hat on and went to a grief group with my books 5 feet away on a table. And I couldn't say, that's me, I'm the grief expert. I had to be the father that buried a child. And as time went by and I experienced this, I thought, oh, is my experience of what I've been teaching going to be true? Did I have this wrong? Did I have this right? And one of the first things I wanted is to write to every parent I'd ever helped and say, I didn't know how bad the pain was.
Wow.
And then as I began doing this work, I was like, going back to work, I'm sitting at my desk. You can imagine this. I know you know this as a writer. I pick up some papers that I wrote a couple of years before on grief and meaning. And I remember picking it up and going, yeah, like that's going to help this pain. And I threw it back down. Maybe a month later, I picked it up again. And it didn't take away the pain, but it began to cushion it. And I had written this originally because meaning and grief didn't seem to connect with grievers. And I wondered why. I reread Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning. Mm-hmm. And I thought the disconnect is people think when they hear meaning that we're supposed to find meaning in the horrible death, meaning in the COVID death, meaning in the murder, meaning in the cancer, meaning in the terrorist attack, meaning in the tragedy, in the shooting. And the meaning doesn't come then. The meaning comes later in us when we excavate the pain in our own way, in our own time. And I think that really helped. And as I began to write about this for my own healing and my own curiosity, people kept saying, it's kind of the sixth stage of grief. Mm. And I was surprised, Simon and Schuster, and we all, were in contact with the Kubler Ross family, and that they gave me permission to really go and add this as a sixth stage. And I thought, I don't want to I don't want anyone to think I'm adding a new mandatory step. So it was also a chance once more, 20 years later, to go back and say, here's how the stages work. Here's how they don't work. Don't get confused. Some people who don't know grief, the stages help them with a little scaffolding. And if the stages aren't right for you, it's fine. There's no right way to do this.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the meaning piece, because, of course, we can think of big examples like Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Someone loses their teenage daughter to a drunk driver, and they create this global organization that has now prevented, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of millions of deaths. Okay. But most people aren't going to do that. Right. So what is, in your experience, some examples of smaller ways that people have created something that provides that sense of meaning in their life?
So glad you brought that up, because we do think of it as the big things.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember, even for the woman, the amazing person who started Mothers Against Drunk Driving because her own daughter died, it still wasn't worth the cost. She'd rather have her daughter back. And the other thing is to realize our loss. I tell people death happens. Mm-hmm. The reality is the death rate in families, in all of us, is 100%. So we are, despite our best efforts, going to die someday. And when that happens, it isn't a lesson. It doesn't mean you did something wrong or you didn't get all those things. And I always tell people who then go, wait, are you telling us our health doesn't matter in what we do? I often think about, no, do those things to add life to your living and be healthy, but just know you're not going to have an optional death in this lifetime. Still, someday we're going to deal with this with ourselves and our loved ones. So that meaning, I think it's about naming meaningful moments. Mm-hmm. Like right now, I'm going to name this as a meaningful moment. Mm-hmm. Someone out there is going to hear this podcast who knows someone who's treating someone, and it's going to help them. And it makes this so meaningful. And it's just noticing that. I mean, one woman shared with me her child had died, and she talked for me for 2 hours about this little child who was 2 years old that died. And she goes, there's no meaning in that. And I said, of course not. And I've spent 2 hours getting to know your son, Aaron, how meaningful it's been. So it's about naming this different meaning. It can be something you change the world with, but it can be, I always tell people, a part of our loved one, when they die, there's a part of us that dies with them. Mm-hmm. But there's a part of them that lives on in us. Mm-hmm. How can you nurture that part? Mm-hmm. One person shared how their father went through medical school and he did it by working as a waiter. And they grew up so aware from him of waiters need good tips and it's hard work. Yeah. And so after he died, his daughter, in honor of him, nurtured that part that was always going to be the great tipper of the waiter because of her father. So it's those Little things. It doesn't have to be a charity, a 5K walk. Those
Right.
little things we do. So important.
Yeah.
Here's another thought that I have. It's not just death, it's loss in general. That is a part of human experience.
Yes.
And the loss it can be loss of a job, loss of love, loss of a pet, all sorts of things. And I think accepting that is a part of life and part of human experience is helpful. And it also seems to me that every loss that I've experienced feeds into every other loss. That there is a general feeling of loss and sadness, and any loss feeds into that.
Boy, I couldn't have said that better. And let me tell you, it's so important. So first of all, I see exactly that same way. I see it a little different though, but same thing. I see everything as a death.
Mm-hmm.
A breakup is the death of the relationship in the romantic form. A divorce is the death of that marriage.
Mm-hmm.
A job loss is the death of that paycheck in that place with those people. It's all deaths of something.
Yes.
All losses. And here there was something, since we brought up the pandemic, that really put this together for me. March of the pandemic, like first or second week, a friend comes over. We're on the street walking 6 feet apart, maybe 8 feet apart. And we're catching up on my block where I live. And this young woman runs up to us who's in tears. And she says, "You do something about grief, right?" And I said, "Yeah, I write books on." And she goes, "My wedding just got postponed." And she is horribly brokenhearted. And I talk to her. We talk about it. I witness what she's going through. And then she thanks me and leaves eventually. My friend goes, "Oh my gosh. I can't believe she was going on and on about a wedding being postponed to you who's gone to 9/11 and to you who's had a child die. And doesn't she know, like, there's bigger griefs?" And I had to turn to my friend and go, "You don't understand how grief works."
Mm-hmm.
I said, first of all, people always want to know which grief is the worst. Is it a murder? Is it a child's death? Is it your pet that you see 17 years who greets you every day? Which is the law worse? And I always say, yours. Yours. For that 20-year-old who's never experienced anything, she's been dreaming about this wedding. And it is her worst loss. And when we're in our comparing mind, we're not in a healing place because we don't have a broken mind, we have a broken heart. And comparing always works against us. And Andrew, I see you've got a sweet dog in the background.
Mm-hmm.
After my son died, I don't know, 8, 9 months later, my sweet dog of 17 years died. And I can't tell you how many people are like, "But that didn't mean anything," or "Which was the worst?" And I'm going, I've had 2 losses in my life.
Loss is loss.
I have to choose
Right.
or focus on one. They both are in my sphere.
Right.
There doesn't have to be a winner.
Here's an off-the-wall question. Are those real flowers behind you or paper flowers?
Well, look at them downward. I don't know if you can see them.
Yes,
but
I can. So
if
I know many people
they
don't.
were fake,
they wouldn't do that.
It would be wilting.
So I know many people.
Now that I look, I'm embarrassed that I got wilting.
No, that's fine. But I know many people who don't have flowers because they can't face it when they die. And that's what flowers do, and I think that's, again, part of the acceptance of the transitoriness of our experience.
So, Andy, I hear you sharing a wisdom that maybe we could practice managing loss with smaller things like flowers.
Mm-hmm.
So that when the big losses show up in our life, we have a little bit of muscle to manage it.
Yeah.
I think it's so true to recognize these flowers had their season.
Mm-hmm.
Remember how beautiful they were.
Right.
And I see the change in them.
Mm-hmm.
And grief is always a change we don't want.
Yep.
Loss is always a change we don't want.
Right.
Here's the thing, and this goes back to the stuck person you mentioned, your person in your life. On one hand, death throws us into chaos. And many times our response to chaos is to go to the other extreme of no more change.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to tell you, so many people come to me and goes, all right, David, reassure me, no more death. I have to go, oh my gosh, I would love to, but we're on planet Earth.
Yeah.
And just like Andy said, so much more loss is coming even today. Now, here's one of the things that I've learned that helps me. When I sit with, oh my gosh, these flowers are going to die. This day is going to end. There's going to be a sunset. My friends, some of them are going to move away. Some of them are going to get jobs. Pets are going to die. People are going to die. When I really let that in, and I had to, given my work, when I let that in, I can become so shut down or so controlling, or I can also go, you know what? I don't know how long we're here for. This is all so temporary. Let me take today in. Let me make this a more meaningful conversation. I don't want this to be another throwaway podcast. I wanted this to be such a meaningful talk. I don't know when I'm going to see you two again, if I'm going to see you two again. Talk to your audience. Let me take this in and understand how unique it is in all the world. And you know, today, if it turns out to be my last day, and this turns out to be my last podcast, I'm going to be so grateful that I went deep with you. I'm going to be so grateful that I was authentic with you. And hopefully it's not my last day or yours or any of ours. And we get another day to be authentic tomorrow.
So we are talking about, I think, the core principle of Buddhist philosophy, which is impermanence. You know, that was summed up in a little couplet that the sun at noon is the sun declining, the person born is the person dying. And that acceptance of impermanence is one of the keys to enlightenment.
Absolutely. And it gets tricky because here's the thing. I would say, just even talking about the sunset, it seems silly for us to ever watch a beautiful sunset and rage against it.
Yeah, right.
And of course, the Dylan Rage Against the Dying of the Light was actually about blindness, not about death anyway. But the whole thing about missing the sunset. Now, at the end of our life, there's a beautiful moment to be with people. Of course, I'm not saying if someone gets tragically taken away in their youth or in a murder to sit with the beauty of that sunset, because it was a tragic sunset and a tragic end. But I think we miss this sense of we do have this time and it will end. And exactly like you said, and every sunset is the sun working its way back home to rise again.
Yeah.
And we get to do that every day. And, some days I'm better at it than others.
Victoria, I have a question for you. How concerned do you think doctors should be about the physical consequences of grief? Obviously, a person grieving often has very disturbed sleep, digestion, probably depressed immunity, may come to us for help. What do we tell them?
Well, I want to say the first thing we shouldn't tell them is they're depressed and they need an antidepressant medicine. Right. I mean, I think that this sad mood is a normal part of life when we lose someone we love or care for deeply. I don't think that means we can't help with symptom management where appropriate. So in a terribly tragic loss, may be really appropriate to give someone some medicine for a few nights to help them sleep, to give them something to help their stomach, whatever the symptoms may be. But what I worry about is I see this medication or, medicating away the mood as if it's inappropriate to be in a sad state when you've had a loss.
And if I can add to that, so important for folks to hear, I have no issue if someone goes to their psychiatrist when they're in the throes of grief at 1 month, 2 months, and says, I can't do my activities. I can't show up for work. I need help. And a psychiatrist who knows grief helps them through that process, and that may be medication.
Mm-hmm.
I get worried when someone goes to the sports medicine doctor and goes, my knee's hurting. The doctor says, let's get you an x-ray. How's everything else? Oh, our mother died. It's been tough. Let me get you something for that. And it's like, that wasn't even their complaint.
Right.
Like, we don't need to medicate grief and sadness. It's just part of it. And I think that's such an important thing. The other thing that, Andy, in your question was so important. One of the people I work with is Paul Deniston, who does grief yoga. And he's gone back and really adapted movement, and he talks about, because I'm not a yoga person, and he always talks about, it's not that pretzel yoga.
Yeah.
How grief gets stuck in the body. And he studied with Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine. And our emotions need motion. Whenever we're talking about helping people, we always have one of the things is we say, take a walk, and we're like, we can't keep telling people to take a walk. It's too simplistic. And yet it's miraculous how it helps. Moving our body is so helpful. Andy, I have a question for you, if I can.
Yeah.
You're so much an advocate of health and good health. How do you help people with this idea of there's so much power we have over our health? And yet, despite that, we are going to die, or our friends are going to die. And it doesn't mean we did it wrong all the time. There's always things we could do better.
Well, one of the things that I teach is that it's okay to be sick and that perfect health is not obtainable. And when you hear people say, I never get sick, I don't believe that. We are all experience ups and downs in health. And yes, as you said, we should all be doing whatever we can to maintain health. But I think acceptance of sickness is also part of, living.
Right.
But the goal is not to get stuck in it, same as with grief, but to be able to move through it as quickly as you can.
Well, and here's the things I say to people sometimes in their grief that shocks them, and it's true in sickness. I say judgment demands punishment. We will judge others or we'll judge ourselves. And people go, yeah, I'm not judging. And I'll go, but if you're saying, why did I get sick? You're saying, I did something wrong, and here's the consequence, and I've done it wrong because I shouldn't be sick.
Yeah.
The same is true in grief. People go, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Why didn't this clear up for me? Why am I backsliding? And I go, this is what your grief looks like. You're not doing anything wrong. Here's two shocking things. People always want the time element of grief. I think about it as there's the anticipatory grief, the death that happens before. The grief that happens before the death. Then there's the acute grief. That's when we're feel like we're in a free fall. There's nothing but grief, pain. And then we move into early grief. And people, if I went down to the local mall or downtown area and said, when's early grief? People would say, oh, the first month, the first 3 months, maybe it goes all the way to the first year. I think of early grief as an average of 2 years. And when people come and they go, I don't know what's wrong with me, 7 months, it's still bothering me. And I go, it's supposed to at 7 months. You're still in early grief. Then we move into mature grief. I was also at a gathering of grief experts. And one of the consensus that came out of it, and counselors and trauma folks, is the average time when someone shows up to see a therapist for their grief, they walk in and they're like, this grief's been bothering me. I think it's time to talk about it. Do you know when that is? 5 years.
Oh, wow.
They sat with that grief unattended for 5 years.
Those are both surprising to me. 2 years being early grief and that it takes people 5 years. As we move to ending this conversation, I really want to honor what you said, that this is a particular moment where the three of us are in conversation. And is there anything else that you feel, wow, I wish I had the chance to say, fill in the blank?
Well, thank you. I wish I had a canned, perfect response for that. I guess it's that I would say, don't be afraid of these discussions.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be afraid to have them. Don't be afraid to say, being in grief is not a failure. Grief is actually about the love. We don't grieve people we're indifferent to.
Mm-hmm.
Grieve people we're connected to, or things or loved ones. So it's okay to grieve when we don't have to be strong. I think we're seeing that, people ask me, what's a good griever? How can I do grief right? And I always say, by doing it authentically as you.
Yeah.
And if you're sad today, be sad. If you're angry, be angry. Your only job is to feel your feelings. And my goodness, if you're happy today, let that in. Just feel those feelings and don't be afraid. So I'd love for people to just know that. And sort of, the other thing is with our friends, to not be, how do I cheer you up? How do I get you out of this? How do I move on? But to rather say, wow, your mom dying, your spouse dying, your sibling dying, your pet dying, that job. I mean, that must be a lot. I don't have the right words, but just know I'm here for you. That's what ultimately matters, that we're here with one another and we don't walk this road completely alone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for being our guest. And I just want to say, I had the opportunity to read Finding Meaning, the 6th stage of grief. And it is a beautiful book. It is both beautiful in the writing and it is beautiful in the stories that it holds. So thank you so much for that effort.
You're so welcome. And I'll tell you, I just finished, and it's now out there, a workbook for that people will be able to get, because I want people to have these tools to feel like they're sitting with me and walking through that process. And I'm just got to say, I'm just so honored to be with you both, more than you know. And I just want you to know you've given me amazing meaning today.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.